"I never had a wife," he said once, his voice low and steady, as though the words were carved in stone. The Apache warrior had lived his life among the rugged hills and quiet valleys of the old American frontier, a place where wooden houses leaned with age, horses' hooves stirred the dirt roads, and the echo of church bells on Sunday morning was the only sound that broke the stillness. To the villagers, he was a shadow, someone who walked with silence, carrying the weight of battles long past. Children whispered stories about him. Mothers warned their sons not to stare too long, and the old men nodded knowingly, remembering when blood and dust once ruled the land. Yet behind his dark eyes was not anger but loneliness, a loneliness he himself had stopped noticing until the day fate brought him to the creek. The village sat at the edge of the wilderness, a cluster of wooden cabins with smoke curling from their chimneys, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass that swayed like waves under the wind. Folks here were cautious, for they lived between two worlds, the fading whispers of the old frontier and the uneasy rise of new settlers who measured worth by land and coin. The Apache did not belong fully to either side. He was neither the enemy they once feared nor the neighbor they fully trusted. He existed somewhere in between, a man shaped by traditions and scars, yet drawn to the simplicity of quiet mornings when the village came alive with the creak of wagon wheels, the call of merchants, and the laughter of children chasing dogs. Down the lane, he had no family, no wife, no children of his own. Many said he chose this life, that he carried a wound deeper than flesh and emptiness carved by loss. Around the firelight, when the village men shared stories, they spoke of him as if he were a ghost, brave, restless, untamed. The young ones admired him for his strength, while the elders shook their heads, saying a man who has no wife and no kin is a man with no roots. But the Apache never answered back. He simply walked past them with steady steps, his moccasins soundless against the earth, his eyes fixed on something distant. It was by the creek that things began to change. The creek was not much more than a thin ribbon of water winding through the meadow, but to him it was a place of memory. He would sit at its edge when the sun began to dip low, letting the cool breeze brush against his face. There he found silence, away from the watchful eyes of the village. The water carried secrets, and sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could hear the voices of the past, the drums of his people, the laughter of a younger time, the sorrow of farewells too heavy to speak. It was here, at this meeting place, between solitude and memory, that she appeared. She was not from his world, at least not in the way one might think. She carried herself with a quiet grace, her hands rough from work but her gaze soft, as though she could see through the hardest stone. He noticed her first by accident when her reflection trembled in the ripples of the creek. She was kneeling by the water, washing linen, her sleeves rolled high, strands of hair falling loose around her face. She hummed as she worked, a tune so gentle it seemed to settle the very air. He could have walked away unseen, he had always been good at that. But for the first time in many years, he stayed, watching, listening, feeling something stir inside him that he thought had long died. Day after day, he found himself returning to the creek. Sometimes she was there, sometimes not, but the thought of her presence kept him restless. He never spoke at first. He only watched from a distance, careful not to intrude, careful not to break the fragile peace. The villagers would not approve, and Apache and a woman from their own bloodlines was not a story they would welcome. Yet the pull was stronger than his fear. The more he saw her, the more he began to notice the way her laughter touched the air, the way her hands moved with care, the way her eyes carried a light that reminded him of something he had lost but never named. The old village carried its own rhythm: harvest in the fall, storms in the spring, long winters where families huddled by the fire. Everyone knew each other's business, and secrets were hard to keep. Still, their meetings by the creek remained hidden, wrapped in the fen sound of flowing water and rustling reeds. He started leaving small signs, not gifts but tokens, a polished stone, a feather, a sprig of sage. She would find them and smile, though she never spoke of it. And when their eyes finally met, truly met, there was no turning away. He felt alive. In her presence, as though the years of silence had finally broken. Yet words did not come easily to him. He was a man of actions, of glances, of quiet gestures. She understood. She did not press him with questions or force him to speak. She only shared her time washing clothes, filling her pail, listening. To the birds, sometimes she hummed. Sometimes she said nothing at all. And in that silence, something grew between them, something stronger than the barriers of their worlds. But not all eyes were blind. The village was small, and whispers traveled. Quickly, some had seen the Apache by the creek more than once. Others noticed the woman's gaze drifting when she should have been working. The elders began to murmur, their voices sharp with caution. They remembered old wounds, battles fought not far from their land, blood spilled on both sides. To them, a bond between the Apache and one of their own was dangerous, foolish, even sinful. Still, the woman did not turn away. Her heart did not bow to fear. The creek became more than a meeting place. It became a secret world, a fragile sanctuary. Yet every moment they spent there carried risk, and every glance held unspoken questions. Was love strong enough to survive? The walls others would build against it? Could two souls, bound by loneliness and drawn by fate, truly find peace in a world that refused to forget the past? The Apache, who had once declared he would never have a wife, now felt his heart pulling toward the very thing he had denied. But he also knew the cost. To claim such love was to challenge not just the whispers of a village, but the weight of history itself. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon and the creek shimmered in fading light, he stood before her, his chest heavy with words he had never spoken. She looked at him, waiting, her eyes steady, her hands still. The air thickened, the silence pressed closer, and for a heartbeat, time itself seemed to hold. He opened his mouth to speak, to cross the boundary between silence and truth, but before the words could leave him, a sound broke the stillness, footsteps on the path, voices calling from the distance, growing nearer with every breath. Their world by the creek was no longer hidden, and in that moment, both of them knew their lives would never be the same. The voices carried across the meadow before the figures appeared, and she instinctively pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The Apache stepped back into the shadow of the trees, his body tense, his eyes sharp. He had lived long enough to know the sound of suspicion. The laughter and chatter from the path were not carefree. They held a weight, an edge, as if the men approaching already suspected more than they should. She turned her head slightly, her heart racing, but she did not call out to him. He understood. He would not put her in harm's way by being seen at her side too soon. Still, the sudden nearness of others left a heaviness in the air, as though the creek itself had lost its calm. When the villagers came into view, they greeted her with polite nods, yet their eyes lingered longer than usual. They asked about her chores, about her family, about the weather, all in tones too casual to be natural. She answered softly, her voice steady, but she felt their curiosity pressing against her like a blade. The Apache watched from the edge of the woods, unseen but not blind. He could feel the shift, the danger building, and he knew the moment of quiet days by the water would not last. That night, alone by the fire in his small cabin on the outskirts of the village, he thought about her. He thought about the way her eyes held trust even when fear might have been easier. For years he had carried himself as though he needed nothing, no bond, no home beyond the earth and sky. But now he could not ignore the pull. He remembered the words of his elders, the warnings that to walk between two worlds was to belong to none. Yet he also remembered the silence of his past, the loneliness that had once been his only companion. For the first time, he questioned whether he was willing to return to that silence if it meant losing her. The woman, too, lay awake in her small room above her father's workshop. She had always been considered different in the village, not unkind, but not fully understood. She carried a gentleness that seemed to unsettle others who preferred the sharpness of survival. She had seen hardship, the long winters that stole, crops, the sickness that took her mother, the years of labor that bent her father's back. But none of it had hardened her heart. If anything, it had made her softer, more aware of the quiet strength that lies in kindness. That was what drew her to the Apache. In his silence, she sensed the same weight of loss she carried. In his steady gaze, she saw something rare truth without disguise. The villagers, however, saw something else entirely. To them, he was a reminder of battles not so far behind, of raids and fires and losses too fresh to be forgotten. The war. Drums might have stopped, but the memory remained. Old men on porches still told stories of nights when the sky glowed with flame, of cries that haunted them long after. The Apache carried all of those memories in their eyes, even if he himself had no part in those particular nights. To the people, he was a symbol, and symbols were harder to forgive than men. Days turned into weeks, and their secret meetings at the creek continued, though now they were colored by unease. He began to notice tracks in the dirt where none had been before, the faint imprint of boots near the water's edge. Once, he even found a broken twig too carefully placed, as though someone had hidden in the brush. He said nothing to her, but he kept his hand closer to the knife at his belt, his ears sharp for the rustle of movement. She, too, felt the change, though she tried to carry on as though nothing weighed upon her. Their time together was too precious to spoil with fear, even if fear followed them like a shadow. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air smelled of rain, she asked him a question she had long carried in silence. "Why do you stay here," she whispered, "among people who will not welcome you?" He looked at her for a long moment, his face calm, though his eyes held storms. "Because this land is mine as much as it is theirs. My people walked these fields before their cabins stood. I stay because leaving would mean forgetting, and I will not forget." His voice was steady, yet there was pain beneath it. She reached for his hand, and though he hesitated, he did not pull away. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, something stronger than words. Yet even as their bond deepened, the danger grew. Rumors began to swirl in the village, whispers of the Apache seen too near the creek, of a woman's absence from chores too often explained away. The elders gathered in low voices behind closed doors. The preacher warned in his sermons of temptation, of straying from the righteous path. Though no names were spoken, the message was clear, and it spread like smoke through the town. Her father noticed the change first. He saw the way she returned from the meadow with a brightness in her eyes, a glow that had not been there before. He asked questions she could not answer without revealing her secret. She smiled and turned away, but his suspicion grew, gnawing at him until it became anger. In the village, a father's honor was tied to his daughter's reputation, and whispers threatened to stain them both. He began to watch her more closely, his tone sharper, his patience thin. She loved her father, but she could not tell him the truth, not yet, perhaps not ever. The Apache knew the time for secrecy was closing, but he did not know what would follow if their bond was revealed. He had faced battles before, but this was different. This was not a fight of weapons, but of hearts and histories, of memories too heavy to erase. He wondered if love could stand against such weight, or if it would crumble beneath it. Then came the night of the storm. The sky split open with lightning, The rain fell hard, and the creek swelled with fury. She had gone to the meadow despite the weather, drawn by the thought of him. He was already there, waiting under the trees, his figure lit by flashes of fire. In the sky. They stood together in the rain, the world around them drowned in water and thunder. For a brief moment, it felt as though nothing else existed, no village, no whispers, no past, no future. Only them, but as the storm raged, voices rose above the thunder. Lanterns flickered in the distance, moving closer. Men were coming there. Shadows long against the rain. The Apache stiffened, his hand on his knife, his instincts alive. She gripped his arm, her heart pounding. They had been found. The lanterns grew brighter, the voices louder. The villagers were searching, their words sharp, their anger carried on the wind. There was no longer a place to hide. The creek, once their sanctuary, had betrayed them with its open meadow and storm-swollen banks. He looked at her, his face torn between fight and flight. She looked back, her eyes steady despite the fear. They stood there, drenched in rain, caught between the two world they had created and the one that threatened to tear it apart. And as the first lantern light broke through the trees, casting its glow upon them, the choice neither of them wanted to make pressed down with unbearable weight. The storm roared louder, drowning the shouts of the men for a moment, but it could not silence what was coming. The night had turned, and with it, their fate. The creek no longer promised safety. It promised only the test of what love could endure when the world itself seemed determined to break it. The rain pounded harder, rolling off the leaves, dripping from the branches, soaking them until their clothes clung heavy to their skin. The Apache's sharp eyes darted toward the lanterns as they bobbed closer, the voices of men cutting through the storm. He recognized them, the butcher's son, the mill worker, the blacksmith's apprentice, young men carrying the weight of their elders' suspicions. Their words twisted with anger, though fear hid beneath it, fear of the unknown, fear of what they believed they could not control. The Apache's hand pressed against the hilt of his knife, not in threat but in readiness, as if the years of survival demanded that he brace himself for what was coming. She held his arm tightly, her fingers trembling though she tried to appear calm. Her heart beat wildly, torn between love and dread. She could see it in their faces already, even through the rain. Those men weren't looking for answers. They were looking for proof. Proof of what the whispers had already convinced them was true. And if they found it, there would be no undoing. The storm that followed, the lanterns cast a golden glow across the swollen creek, illuminating the reeds, the rocks, and finally, the two figures standing together. Silence fell for a moment, broken only by thunder overhead. The men froze, their suspicions now shaped into certainty. One of them spat onto the ground, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around the handle of his lantern. "I knew it," he muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. "She's been sneaking out here with him." The words sliced through the night. Another voice, harsher, called out, "What do you think you're doing, girl? Don't you know who he is?" The Apache said nothing, his body still, his gaze steady. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than words, but here it was a blade that cut both ways. His silence was read as defiance, as arrogance, when in truth it was caution. She wanted to answer, to defend him, to speak her heart, but the words stuck in her throat. Her voice, gentle as it was, would sound small against their shouts. The men advanced, stepping through the mud, their lanterns swinging wildly. The rain blurred their outlines, but the intent in their stride was clear. She stood between them and the Apache without thinking, her body a shield even though she knew it would not hold. The butcher's son sneered at her, his anger swelling. "You're a fool," he said. "You don't know what you're doing. Men like him don't belong here." Her voice finally broke free, shaking but strong. "He belongs here as much as any of you. More, even. His people walked this land before you ever built your houses. And you know it." Her words silenced them for a heartbeat. The truth hung in the air like the heavy clouds above. But truth alone could not bend hearts hardened by years of fear. The blacksmith's apprentice scowled and stepped closer, his fists clenched. "Don't speak for him. You don't know what he is capable of." The Apache's eyes flicked to her, then back to the men. He knew the tension could snap at any moment. If one of them moved too fast, if a blade was drawn or a fist was swung, blood would follow. And blood was a wound that could never heal in this village. The storm grew worse, thunder splitting the sky. A sharp crack of lightning illuminated all their faces. The fear, the anger, the love caught in the middle of it. And then, as if nature itself demanded an end, the lanterns sputtered under the rain, one by one going dark. The meadow fell into shadow, lit only by the faint silver glow of the storm-tossed sky. The men cursed and stumbled, their moment of unity broken. In that confusion, she tugged at the Apache's hand, urging him back into the woods. He hesitated, torn between standing his ground and protecting her, but her pleading eyes decided for him. They slipped into the darkness, vanishing into the trees as the storm swallowed their trail. Back in the village, the whispers grew louder. The young men returned drenched and bitter, their story fanned into flame by eager ears. The preachers. Warnings found new weight, the elder's mutters grew harsher, and her father's fury boiled into something sharper than words. He confronted her, his voice shaking with rage. "Tell me it isn't true. Tell me you haven't shamed us with him." Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not bow. "I love him," she whispered, and the words shattered whatever hope her father had of denial. His face twisted, caught between grief and anger. To him, love was not an excuse but a betrayal. He turned from her without another word, his silence heavier than any curse. The Apache, meanwhile, sat alone by his fire that night, his mind restless. He had lived his life in solitude, bound by the weight of memory, but now his choices affected more than himself. He had seen the look in those men's eyes, violence waiting for a reason. He knew the path ahead was narrowing, pressing him toward a decision he could not yet make. The days that followed were heavy with tension. She was watched more closely, her steps shadowed, her every move noted. The villagers whispered behind her back, some out of pity, others with disgust. The Apache was followed too, though not openly. He could feel the eyes on him whenever he passed through the square, the way conversations hushed when he drew near. The space between him and the people grew wider, though it had never been narrow to begin with. One evening, as dusk painted the sky, he visited the creek alone. The water had calmed since the storm, but the land still bore scars, broken branches, torn roots, earth washed away. He knelt by the water and touched the surface with his fingers, remembering the way her hand had held his in the storm. It was then he heard movement, not hers but another's. Out of the trees stepped an old man, stooped but steady, his face lined with years. It was one of the elders, a man who had once fought in battles long past. "You're bringing trouble." "Here," the old man said, his voice quiet but sharp. "The people will not forgive this. They will not forgive you." The Apache did not look up. "Do they need to forgive me for loving her?" The elder shook his head. "Love is not the question. Memory is. The ground we stand on is heavy with blood, and no heart can change that overnight. You will suffer for it. She will suffer more." The words cut deep because they were true. The Apache said nothing, but the silence spoke his torment. The elder turned away, his cane pressing into the mud as he walked. "You cannot stay between two worlds forever," he said over his shoulder. "Soon one will close against you, and the other will not open. The days stretched, each one adding weight to the air. Rumors of a meeting spread, a gathering of the elders and the strongest man, a decision to be made. She heard whispers through her father's workshop walls, catching only fragments. Honor, shame, danger, banishment. The words twisted her stomach with dread. She longed to run to the creek, to tell him, to hold on to what they had built, but the eyes of the village followed her too closely. At night, she dreamed of the storm, of lanterns bobbing through the dark, of men's voices shouting her name. She would wake with her chest tight, her hands reaching for him only to find empty air. And always, the fear pressed in, that the choice would be ripped from them before they could make it themselves. The Apache, too, felt the walls closing. He spent his nights sharpening his knife, not for war but for the fear of it. He walked the woods with a hunter's caution, listening for footsteps that did not belong. He knew the village was not waiting idly. Something was coming, and as the days shortened, as autumn crept in with its chill winds and golden leaves, the creek once again became their place of refuge. But even there, the sound of the water seemed restless, carrying not peace but warning. They clung to each other in silence, both knowing that the storm they had survived was only the beginning. The lanterns that once revealed them would return, brighter, fiercer, and not so easily extinguished. And when they did, neither love nor silence might be enough to hold back the fire they carried. The days grew shorter, and the nights longer, until autumn seemed to press its weight over the village like a heavy blanket. Smoke curled from chimneys in the evenings, and the sound of axes echoed from the woods as men cut logs for winter. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, something darker stirred. Whispers spread faster than the chill wind, and eyes followed her every step with suspicion. She could feel it when she walked through the market square, when she carried baskets of bread, when she fetched water from the well. Every glance was sharper, every silence heavier, as though the village itself waited for her to falter, her father's. Disappointment had hardened into something harsher. He spoke little to her now, his jaw set, his voice clipped when he had to give her a task. Once, he had been her shield against the world, the man who had lifted her onto his shoulders when she was small, who had worked his hands raw to keep food on the table. Now he looked at her as if she had chosen to betray him. She tried to reach him, to explain what she felt, but her words dissolved against the wall he had built. The more she tried, the higher it seemed to grow. The Apache felt the change too. Whenever he entered the village to trade, the air thickened. Men stood with arms crossed, women pulled their children closer, and even the dogs growled low under their breath. He walked with his head high, his steps calm, but his hand always hovered near his belt where his knife rested. He did not want conflict, but he could feel it stalking him like a wolf in the brush. Every instinct told him it was only a matter of time. Still, he and the woman met at the creek whenever they could. Some shifted in their seats, avoiding his gaze. Others clenched their fists tighter, unwilling to yield. Her father's face was pale, torn between pride and fear, between the love he had for his daughter and the weight of his standing among the villagers. The butcher's son was the first to break the silence. Pretty words don't change who you are. You can dress it up however you want, but you'll always be the enemy. His voice dripped with bitterness, and the crowd began to murmur again. The preacher seized the moment, raising his voice like a hammer striking iron. This is temptation in plain sight. A wolf among sheep, cloaked in false humility. If we allow this, we open our doors to sin, to ruin. His words whipped the crowd into motion. Men stood, women gasped, and the hall buzzed with the energy of a mob on the verge of turning. The Apache did not move. He stood tall, his silence more powerful than the shouts around him. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. If you call it sin, then I am guilty. If you call it ruin, then I will bear it. But don't call it false. This is truth. I love him. The words struck harder than any weapon. Gasps echoed through the hall. Her father staggered as though struck, his hand rising to his mouth, his eyes glistening with tears he would not let fall. The elders leaned forward, their faces unreadable, caught between outrage and reflection. The blacksmith's apprentice shouted, "Then you choose him over all of us." The question, though framed as accusation, held the weight of truth. And she, trembling, lifted her chin and said, "I do." Chaos erupted. Voices clashed, hands slammed tables, lanterns wavered as the crowd surged with fury. The preacher called for punishment, the butcher's son shouted for exile, and the hall threatened to boil into violence. Outside, the storm that had loomed all day broke loose, rain lashing against the roof, thunder cracking as though heaven itself joined the debate. The elders raised their hands for silence, and slowly, reluctantly, the noise ebbed. The oldest of them, his beard white, his voice cracked with age, stood and spoke. "We cannot decide tonight with anger in our throats. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, we will gather again, and then we will decide what must be done." The crowd murmured but obeyed. The preacher lowered his Bible, the young men glared, and the villagers began to file out into the storm. The Apache and the woman stood side by side, silent as the hall emptied. Her father did not look at her. The last thing she saw before the door closed was his back retreating into the rain. That night, they met at the creek. The rain had swollen it again, the water rushing fast, carrying branches and leaves in its current. They sat under the shelter of the trees, their bodies close, their silence heavy. She leaned against him, her tears falling freely now. "What will they do?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "I do not know. But whatever they decide, it will not change this." He placed her hand against his chest where his heart beat. "Steady. They can take me from this land, but they cannot take me from you." The hours passed, the storm eased, and the sky began to lighten with the pale glow of dawn. The decision awaited them, heavy as the coming day. When the villagers gathered once more, the square was filled. Faces hard with judgment stood alongside others shadowed by doubt. The preacher took his place, his voice sharp as ever, but the elders silenced him with a raised hand. The white-bearded elder stood again, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before, settling on the Apache and the woman who stood together at the front. "We are bound by memory," the elder said. "We are bound by tradition. But memory does not build the future, it only warns it. This man has caused no harm here. He has not stolen, he has not fought, he has not threatened. His only crime, if it is crime, is love. And love, though it may shame some, is not a knife to the throat of this village." The crowd stirred, some protesting, others nodding. The elder raised his hand again. "We cannot undo the past, but we can choose what we carry forward. Cast him out, and we sow more hate. Let him stay, and perhaps we learn a different way." The preacher's face flushed red, but his protests were drowned by the murmurs of the people. The butcher's son shouted again, but fewer voices rose with him. The tide was shifting, uncertain but undeniable. Her father stepped forward at last, his face lined with exhaustion. He looked at his daughter, then at the Apache. His voice cracked when he spoke. "I do not understand this. I cannot pretend. It does not wound me. But I cannot be the man who takes away her heart. If she chooses him, then I must let her." The silence that followed was thick with finality. The elders conferred in low voices, then raised their heads. "He may stay," the white-bearded elder declared. "But the weight of his choice and hers is theirs to bear. If harm comes from it, the blame will not be ours." The decision fell like a stone into water, rippling through the crowd. Some turned away in disgust, others in reluctant acceptance. The preacher stormed from the square, his Bible clutched tight. The butcher's son spat on the ground and left. But the tide of violence had broken without spilling blood. The Apache and the woman stood together, their hands entwined. Their faces were not triumphant, but steady, as though they understood the cost of what had just been given. Acceptance would not come overnight, nor would love erase every scar. But they had been given space to exist, and in that space lay hope. As the villagers dispersed, the two of them walked to the creek once more. The water rushed on endless, carrying away the leaves and branches of the storm. She looked at him, her eyes still wet, her lips trembling with a smile. "We are still here," she whispered. He nodded, his voice soft. "We are." The sun broke through the clouds then, casting its light across the meadow, across the village, across the two figures standing at the edge of the water. The past still lingered, the future still uncertain, but in that moment they had carved out something the world could not easily take away. And as the creek flowed on, carrying its secrets into the distance, their story became another part of the land whispered in the village for years to come, not just as a tale of scandal, but as proof that love, even when tested by memory and fear, could endure.